your title, and I guess like in however you can sum up what you've done so far in your life in a few lines or so.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm Stephen Chan. I'm the Professor of World Politics at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, known as SOAS. And I was also the foundation dean there. I've worked in a number of African universities as well as Middle Eastern universities. And what I've tried to do in my life is to be the kind of academic that's actively involved in the affairs of different countries. In Africa, this has been mostly Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. But in the Middle East has been mostly Palestine and Qatar. And I've also been, so my sympathies have always been with the emerging world. I used to be an international civil servant. I continue to have a private practice in terms of helping governments, to which I'm sympathetic, and opposition parties. This is a pro bono activity. I don't charge any money at all for this kind of activity. I just want to be helpful. Along the way, I've written 35 academic books, largely on African issues and on issues to do with multiculturalism and religious tolerance. So that's the kind of thing that I've been involved with. And I hope that I'll be able to continue doing this kind of thing for a little bit longer.
And Robert Mugabe, who, in lieu of, I think, the greater Bobby Wine story has of course resurfaced for us, at least, being a sort of like a news publication in Southern Africa. Robert Mugabe is one of the first people we think of as being very similar to Museveni, and the elections that I concluded in Uganda. What does democracy mean in an autocratic state? And I think as you kind of address that question, it'd be very helpful for you to kind of intertwine your answer with different examples or context on the African continent.
There are a number of autocratic states, including a number pretending to be democracies and going through the protocols and routines of democratic processes that all the same always lead to the result of the autocracy remaining in power. So I think you've got a problem here of aspiration and actual practice. And it's very clear that throughout the continent, young people in particular are becoming very dissatisfied with this. So you've got a problem not only of authoritarianism and autocracy, but an autocracy run by old men. And so there's a youth gap here. And it's very, very natural for young people to become frustrated about this, because age does not necessarily confer wisdom by itself. You've got to keep up with modern ways of thinking and modern ways of running a government. And the absence of this kind of thing leads, of course, to frustration, not just in Africa. Of course, you had the example of the Arab Spring just 10 years ago, but right now, even as we speak, you have the example of an old president in Belarus, in Europe, who patently stole the election. And ever since then, people, many of them very young people, but not just young people, out in the streets on a daily basis, trying to protest against the theft of the election. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. However, having said that, what you do see are examples of very special bravery on the part of young people in Africa. I very much admire what Bobi Wine tried to do. Bobi Wine represents the first major youth protest against the old man who has basically bullied his way to power in election after election. He, even more than Robert Mugabe, epitomizes the man who has elections but insists that there are elections that only he can win. So that it's election after election where the opposition leader seems to spend voting day, for instance, in prison.
Point out the fact that Museveni has this interesting contrast when contrasted with Mugabe, of how he sort of insists on having free elections that only he essentially has the ability to win. But I think despite, despite you kind of like associating that, I mean, not really saying that it's only exclusively to Museveni, but I think many people do perceive, generally speaking, that with sort of like legal or illegal means or practices, it's an assumption among young people that, leaders are doing everything they absolutely can within democratic power, and in some cases outside of that power, to clinch onto, political power. Is this a trend that you think is evident on the African continent? Is it unique to the African continent? Like, is on the global scale, is this actually like a phenomena that's just like, only present in Africa, or is it similar in other sort of developing regions as well?
It's familiar in many, many places. I mean, you take the case of the Hong Kong students right now. They're students, which means that they're all in their 20s, and they're protesting against Beijing and against the, as it were, puppets that Beijing has placed in power in Hong Kong. And this is very much a youth revolt. It's not going to be successful. China and the Hong Kong authorities have very great securitized capacities. But it shows you an example in Asia, for instance, where the young wish to rise up and have been very, very brave in doing so. And as I say, you have this example also in the Middle East and North Africa, but not just confined to North Africa. The terrible tragedies in Syria, for instance, very much were the result of young people in the middle of the Arab Spring trying to rise up and being met by military force, which then snowballed, and the military struggle was then taken over by many, many other interest groups and factions. And even in China, you have a very strange rule that when you're standing for the Politburo of the one-party state, you can't be more than the age of 60. Of course, what they then do after they retire from the Politburo or even the presidency, their power's behind the throne. But even there, they're wise enough to know they've got to go through the cosmetics, at least, of understanding the difficulties that young people see in old leadership. Now, the problem is that in many African countries, the presidents don't even want to do the cosmetics. They just want to hang in there front and center from beginning to the bitter end. I mean, Mr. Mugabe would have stayed in power till the bitter end, until his dying day, if he hadn't been overthrown by his own generals. And there comes a moment of decency and dignity when you have to step down. But the wise president should step down long before that point in time. Otherwise, you're not only aged, you're ridiculous.
Why can bodies like the AU, for instance, or any other, sort of like individual sort of like world leading nations do to sort of like make sure that these leaders who are ruling for too long and perhaps at the detriment of their nation can be sort of better managed and controlled to mitigate some of that happening in the now, and perhaps mitigating that in the long run, to have less leaders like that surface on the continent. What do you like to see being done more, and by who, really, in terms of sort of like overwatching or other bodies that can influence those methods?
Well, outside bodies, even an outside body like the African Union can't tell the member countries how to run their own affairs. And what countries have got to do, however, on their own, but with AU encouragement and encouragement from elsewhere, is to enforce the term limits on presidents. In other words, if it's 2 terms, then it's 2 terms. Now, of course, everyone tries to change the constitution so they can get a 3rd term. But this is where the constitution and the judiciaries have really got to be very strong, that 2 terms means 2 terms. You can extend the terms, like, for instance, for some time, at the early days of the French Fifth Republic, the presidency had a 7-year term, and if you had 2 terms, that was 14 years. And that was quite enough for anybody. So you could try to play something like that. But look, a 5-year term, 2 sets of 5-year terms should be enough. If you haven't been able to improve your country after 10 years, you're quite clearly not up to it. It's as simple as that. So what are you doing with your 10 years in power that you want to have another 5 or even more years in power? So I really do think that the AU can apply moral pressure. It can't change the constitutions of individual countries. It doesn't have sovereign power. That's what you fought for independence, to have your own sovereign power. But I think that citizens should be very, very jealous of what the Constitution says. The Constitution is meant to be a document of fairness. It's meant to empower the citizens, and it's meant to limit authoritarianism. That's what a good constitution is meant to do. The important thing for African countries to develop. Now, it's a difficult ask, but you look at what they've done with the new constitution in Kenya. You look at the very splendid South African constitution negotiated after all of those terrible years of apartheid. It took 4 years to negotiate that constitution after the release of Mandela in 1990, and finally majority rule elections in 1994. But they came to majority rule with a superb constitution of equalities, where even former presidents like Mr. Jacob Zuma could be put on trial, for instance. So these are important things. I'm a great believer in constitutional rule, but it has to be a modern constitution. You've got a chance to set an example to the rest of the world, so that, for instance, in South Africa, since I made a remark about that constitution confers the greatest range of equalities of any constitution in the world. It's the world's best constitution when it comes to equalities, not just of the races. Of course, it overcomes the legacy of apartheid, where there was racial discrimination, but gender discrimination. All of these things are outlawed underneath the Constitution. And so it's a huge example to all of the rest of us as to how to approach the dignity of citizens, therefore the equality of citizens. So Africa gets some things right, but you've got to make the decision as citizens. Are you going to do it? Are you going to make the big step? And set an example not only for the future of your country, but to think more widely and set an example for the future of the world, making a contribution to that wider world. It should be a global aspiration. And that means it shouldn't be old men who are looking to the past and who don't understand the forces of globalization.
What do you think, kind of stands out and strikes you the most when you sort of think about, power transitioning from Museveni to Bobi Wine in the election, that at least that could have been a possible scenario. How do you think that could happen? And do you think that situations like that in the specific Ugandan case and any other case of where you have a leader that has been in power for too long, would those go smoothly? Would they go better than many people think? And what are the keys to making sure that those transitions are sort of safe and sound and beneficial to everybody?
No, I mean, you've been asked a bunch of million-dollar questions, of course. I mean, there have been successful transitions, apart from the case examples that you mentioned. In 1991, for instance, President Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia was defeated in elections that he was forced to call by youth protest. It was the university students who rose up first in 1990 after what happened in Europe. They watched the fall of the Berlin Wall and said, we want this too. And of course, what you have is a change not only in government, but of political parties taking government. Same in Ghana, where in the wake of Jerry Rawlings, different political parties won elections to form governments. So when you've just got the government party winning elections all the time, then you've got to have suspicions. If the opposition party could sometimes win, then what you've got there, as in both Ghana and the Zambian cases, you've got a sense that there's actually some kind of genuine party democracy there. And set an example, I think, really does require education. The Ethiopians really are a bit special in that ever since they overthrew the Stalinist communist regime at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, their leadership has gone out of their way to become educated. I'm a professor at a university. But I really do believe in education transforming not only leaderships, but young people's capacity for leadership. So I support things like the Leadership University. I support schools of leadership and schools of public administration that are starting to spring up in African universities. The new Mbeki School of Leadership, which is starting up now at the University of South Africa, is a very, very modern one. But I think you've got to have big visions. In other words, if you look at probably the best school of leadership, they don't call it that, but at Harvard, the Kennedy School of Public Administration, high level, totally high level. When Africa produces leadership academies, universities, schools, institutes like that, you're going to have, starting with the young people who put themselves through this, suffering their way through this, you're going to have the makings of a new generation that is just going to set the world alight.
So yeah, is democracy a viable option for all African states? As in, I think that's of course another hot topic for us young people, or question for us young people. And I'm sure, as you for somebody with your knowledge, it's a lot more complicated than to ask in those very few words in a question. But yeah, I think key ideas and responses or conclusions that you've entertained as you probably thought about this question.
No, I mean, I've got a very simple answer, and that is everyone wants to have the right to choose. You want to choose what clothes you wear, you want to choose what food you eat. All of us even get a bit fussy. I think we've got a right to choose the kind of government that rules over us. And I would like to see that as a common practice, not just in Africa, but everywhere, that citizens have the right to choose within a constitutional framework, of course. I mean, the struggle against colonialism wasn't just to replace one form of dictatorship, a white dictatorship, by another. I mean, that's stupid. That is not what the founding fathers of Africa fought for. They fought for the right to choose. People want to have not just growing pains and ask, when are we going to come out of these growing pains as young countries? But they want to be able to say, look, we've actually reached a stage of maturity now. We've just passed our teenage years by some time, actually. Let's get it right. Let's get it down. Let's have the right to be trusted as mature citizens who can choose a mature and well-educated government. Citizens have got a right to have some say, some choice over the kind of government that rules over them. It's time to step up. It's time to move on. It's time to tell old people that, okay, you've had your turn. Let a younger generation take over.
Thank you for joining us. For more, come back next week where we explore more topics and stories. We'd like to thank Professor Chan for giving us his time and insight. For more on him and his books, check out the description.